1960. As a wide-eyed Boy Scout, I took my first trip to the Boundary Waters. And it really changed me. And I went back many, many times, both as a Boy Scout, but also with my family and friends. And it became a really important place for me. And I'm sure many of you can say the same thing. In fact, when I got married, my wife Carol and I, for our honeymoon, we took a 3-week canoe trip through the Boundary Waters and up into the Quetico. I figured if she survived that, she was a keeper. And by golly, she survived. And she was also a witchy girl, so she knew all about camping. Back, the problem with camping with a witchy girl is your canoe can never touch the land. So I had to learn that process. I wasn't quite that good of a camper. So anyway, that's how it started. You know, when I think back, when I started in the early 60s, there were still a lot of protections yet to come from the Boundary Waters. You know, they got rid of aircraft and they got rid of boat motors and a lot of restricted boat motors in a lot of the Boundary Waters. They ended logging in the Boundary Waters and they increased the size of the Boundary Waters. And so there were a lot of protections and it seemed like it just constantly got better over time. They even, my only argument against the Forest Service is when they got rid of the canoe rests on the portage. I really didn't think that impacted the wilderness. And so I had to learn how to, you know, as you're stumbling along, especially as you get older, trying to find 2 trees that are the right size where you can jam that canoe in and get up from underneath it and rest your shoulders. Was a little bit of a safety issue, but anyway, I guess the Forest Service wanted me to have that experience. So, and then of course, finally we had the mining ban that was passed in the Biden administration. So everything was progressing in the right direction until just recently when the Trump organization canceled that mining ban. So I really appreciate the fact that I was able to enjoy a wilderness like the Boundary Waters. I mean, what an experience. I went to college out west in Colorado and I visited some of their wilderness areas. They never felt like the wilderness that I was used to. You get up in Boundary Waters, Quetico, that really feels like the wilderness. And it's quite an experience and something we should really treasure and protect. And so I'm really excited to hear what Ingrid's going to tell us about how we're going to move forward. So the title of her, and Ingrid Lyons is the Executive Director of Save the Boundary Waters. And so the title of her talk is Saving the Boundary Waters, Next Steps for Permanent Protection. So please join me in giving Ingrid a hearty Ike's welcome.
Yes. Hello, everybody. It is really, really wonderful to be here. And for people in the back, if you can't hear me, just give me a little bit of these fingers. Same with people online, maybe, you know, let them know via chat or something if you can't hear me. But my name is Ingrid Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of Save the Boundary Waters, as well as its parent organization, Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to see familiar faces. I've actually been with the campaign to save the Boundary Waters for yeah, you did the first one and then
it'll go now. Sorry, I tested everything and then
that's okay. Not an important slide, it's just my name. I've been with Save the Boundary Waters for over a decade. So I actually started as the Northeast Regional Organizer in Duluth, Minnesota in 2015 after I graduated from Carleton College. And I have been with the organization ever since. So I've worked my way up and through and around, and about 4 years ago, I became Executive Director at the ripe old age of 29. So to say it's been a whirlwind over the course of the past 4 or 5 years is an understatement, both in terms of the tremendous victories that we've been able to achieve as an organization and at our core as a coalition, because that's what we are as a coalition, not just a singular organization, and also what we face today, both in terms of what's already happened and what's yet to come. And so my hope with today's presentation is to really sort of demystify a little bit of kind of what happened over the course of the past, importantly, the past, month, 6 weeks, but also just talk about kind of what we've been facing basically since the second Trump administration got started, how did we get where we are? What can we learn from that? And very importantly, where do we go from here to ensure that the boundary waters is permanently protected from hard rock mining? And we will have good, robust discussion, Q&A at the end. If you've got something pressing, point of clarification that helps you understand the presentation, just feel free to shoot your hand up and we can take questions along the way as well. So you all don't need, this presentation or my presentations, there always has to be a section for, so what is the boundary waters? I think this picture is important for anyone to see, whether they've been to the boundary waters 10,000 times or never. It has tremendous impact. And Jim Brandenburg, who of course we lost a little over a year ago, was such a powerful visual storyteller. And this is the most powerful thing I take to Washington, D.C., because I show lawmakers in Arizona who don't know what fresh water like this looks like. They cannot conceptualize it. They gasp. It really makes them understand what's at stake. And it's rare that we get an above the boundary waters view. I think this is a really incredible and powerful image that really demonstrates just how unique the boundary waters and the Quetico Superior ecosystem really are. And so we work, Save the Boundary Waters, specifically on the Rainy River watershed. So that's the watershed of the boundary waters, the one that is north of the Laurentian Divide, which we like to joke is the smallest continental divide that you've never heard of. But really, what we're thinking about is protecting this much larger landscape. Yes, it's about the boundary waters at its core, but when we talk about headwaters being at risk, these are the headwaters of Superior National Forest, Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, Quetico Provincial Park on the Canadian side, and Voyageurs National Park. We are talking about a much bigger system that also has really large implications in terms of migratory pathways and ecosystem ripple effects. It's an economic engine for our region, and a crown jewel of both the Midwest and our public land system nationally. So many of you are probably familiar with the threat, but just to sort of recontextualize and get us all on the same page, this is the mine site as it exists right now. And so the mine that we specifically work on is the Twin Metals mine. That is the one that sort of compelled our organization to begin in 2013, when we realized that there were two federal mineral leases that were held by Encampment, which was the preceding company to this, immediately upstream of the boundary waters. And it raised an alarm. Why are there federal mining leases for hard rock mining as close as 1 mile along waterways that flow into the wilderness, which is meant to be the highest form of protection that American public lands can have? Those two things are inherently incompatible. So how do we start a movement to convince the federal government that this is a place that should not be on the table for federal mineral leasing and development? Because ultimately that is what the federal government can do. It can look at its entirety, its whole sort of portfolio of public lands and minerals, and make decisions based on scientific analysis, cultural resources, legal precedent, and importantly, public input, to say, this actually probably doesn't belong kind of on the menu for mineral leasing. It's not an appropriate place, either because it's incompatible as an industry with an ecosystem, like in this case, or for other cherished landscapes like Yellowstone and Grand Canyon. So this is the mine site as it stands. This is south and east of Ely, Minnesota. The Highway 1 bridge is this a laser pointer? Just up over there. The horizon is the boundary waters. You've got River Point Resort and Outfitting here on the point. North of North Resort, a new fully ADA accessible resort, a Forest Service campground, hundreds of summer homes and year-round homes. And that's the mine site. So there are 4 deposits that Twin Metals seeks to develop in the long run. This is called the Maturi deposit. It is the largest.
You clarify the name of the lake again?
Yes, sorry, I didn't even say it. So this is Birch Lake. And this is the South Kawishwe River. So the water flows out of the wilderness down the South Kawishwe, meets up with Birch Lake, which flows and takes the water up and into the wilderness. And I'll show a map too, so that you can kind of contextualize it a little bit more. I should also mention that I've got brochures on the table back there, as well as annual reports, and they both have path of pollution maps within them that sort of contextualize where the site is relative to the wilderness and the flow of water based on hydrogeological modeling. So South Kawishwe, Birch Lake, 4 deposits. This one is actually not the closest to the wilderness. There's yet another one, the Spruce Road deposit, further north up here. There's also a deposit down here, the Maturi Southwest deposit, and then a deposit underneath Birch Lake called the Birch Lake deposit. And so as of right now, this is the largest deposit that they have and the most viable in terms of actual development. So these days they are focused on developing this largest deposit, which would be an underground deposit. And you know, when we look at this place, when we look at this project, and we think in the beginning, trying to really map out how do we get from point A to point B? Point A being right now, this area, these public lands, these public minerals are on the menu for foreign mining companies or even, you know, national, and it doesn't matter where they're from, but mining companies to come in and apply for leases to conduct hard rock mining, which is understood to be the most toxic industry in America, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. This type of mining is unique in that it's not like iron ore and taconite mining, and that's part of what makes us so concerned about its proximity to the wilderness and the scope of this project. So sulfide or copper mining, this type of mining, you might have also heard it called sulfide mining or copper nickel mining. This type of mining is particularly damaging because what's different about it from iron ore and taconite mining is the ore body or rock body in which these minerals are contained. So we have the Mesaba complex, which contains iron ore, and that's where iron and taconite comes from. There's another complex that makes up essentially the entirety of the arrowhead called the Duluth complex. And that's the complex that contains copper, nickel, palladium, and other trace metals. The sulfides in this ore body, when exposed to air and water over the course of mining, you know, you bring rocks out of the ground, that's classic mining. When they're exposed to air and water, there's a chemical reaction that occurs that creates sulfuric acid. That sulfuric acid then leaches out other trace heavy metals from that ore body, creating something called acid mine drainage, which is basically a highly acidic slurry of heavy metals. That's kind of this type of mining at its worst. But in normal course of this type of mining, there's also runoff of sulfate. And you may be familiar with our sulfate standard in Minnesota, which is 10 parts per million, and is specifically designed to protect wild rice. Because sulfate is very, very damaging to the root bodies of wild rice if there's too much sulfate in a system. Sulfate is also a very important player in the methylization of mercury, which is the type of mercury that bioaccumulates in fish tissue. And so we're looking at a project whose outcomes are pretty already at odds, at fundamental odds with the things that we want to protect in Minnesota. We want to protect wild rice. We want to protect the bird species that rely on that wild rice. We want to protect treaty rights. We want to protect fishing, both from a recreational standpoint and an ecosystem health standpoint. So I'll get more into that, but I always want to remind people why these two types of mining are fundamentally different. And it's not actually appropriate to sort of talk about mining under a singular umbrella in Minnesota, because there's no denying that we are a state that has so many communities that were built on iron and taconite and hematite mining. That is a truth that is undeniable. A lot of those communities wouldn't exist without mining, but this is a completely different beast. And we've never had copper mining in our state. So this is a dangerous foray that we're entering into. And so when we started our organization, you know, public lands are something that people really understand in the West. There are millions of acres of federal public lands in the West, but in Minnesota, there's not nearly as many. And so we quickly realized we had to wrap our heads around who do we need to influence in Washington to say, and through what process to say these mineral leases shouldn't exist and this type of mining should be banned in this place. You know, what is the regulatory process and who do we need to talk to? So we started to go to Washington, D.C. every single month. Becky Rahm is one of the originators of this campaign. She is on our board of directors. And so she was along with many community members and partners going to DC every month, really trying to map out how do we get this done. And what we realized that we needed to do was pursue something called a public land order. A public land order, otherwise called a mineral withdrawal, is a ban on a certain kind of mining or a certain kind of extraction on a certain acreage of public lands. And that is something that lies within the authority of the Interior Secretary. So the Department of Interior manages the Bureau of Land Management, and they are responsible for all the subsurface interest or the minerals in this area. Whereas the Department of Ag manages the Forest Service and they manage the surface in this area. And so we got to work trying to convince, basically, at the time, the Obama administration that they should begin the lengthy process that goes into determining whether or not a section of American public land should be taken out of the mineral portfolio or not. That process is many years long by law because it needs to incorporate robust environmental review, economic review, cultural review, public input, et cetera, et cetera. It's a change in how public lands are managed, and there is a really distinct process set up for that so that it really ticks all the boxes in terms of working with the best information that's out there and working with the public to understand how they feel about it. And so we actually were able to achieve that. So we got the Obama administration to start the process late, kind of in the 11th hour of the administration. That process and study were halted and hidden by the first Trump administration. I'm not going to go into sort of the back and forth ping ponging of this issue between administrations, because I think what's important to understand is we kept at it. We defended the data, the information, the process that we were fighting for. And in 2023, we were actually able to secure that public land order, that mineral withdrawal that we fought for at that point, a decade. And what that protection is 20 years, which is the maximum allowable by law, if it's done by the Interior Secretary, a 20-year ban on hard rock mining on all 225,504 acres of jointly managed federal lands and minerals. And so that represents every last square inch of those types of public lands in this watershed. So this map, I'm surprised I didn't have a map sooner. We're such map people, I'm sorry. But just to place space us a little bit, this line is the watershed boundary. And so water flows up and to the west. The mine site, this is the confluence of Birch Lake here. And if this is hard, this is Birch Lake. This is the South Wishree River. The water flows up and goes up that way. And so the mine site basically ranges from about up here to down here. There are 4 deposits right in that area. And so it's not the most dense area of sort of this ochre color, but it's really important acreage because it's the vast majority of what makes the project workable are some of those squares in there that represent the key parts of American public land that they would need to mine for copper and nickel in this region. And so we were able to accomplish those protections, gaining those protections, which was a huge deal. Thanks to all of you. If you remember submitting a comment, basically between 2016 and 2022, there were many public comment periods. There were public comment events that folks like Bob spoke at in person. I think is it AmSoil? AmSol? AmSoil? At that arena, there was one in Virginia, there was one in the Twin Cities. It was really a huge community effort to submit comments and to really speak very loudly for this quiet place, and that was heard overwhelmingly. Multiple times, the Boundary Waters broke the record for the number of comments submitted on a public lands issue. And all in all, it was over 675,000 Americans who submitted comments on this project, the vast majority of which said, not this mine, not this place. And so that's what we accomplished. We were going to use those 20 years to make it permanent. So on the federal level, we know we have Senator Tina Smith, who has emerged as a tremendous champion for the Boundary Waters. We also have Representative Betty McCollum, and together they have permanent protection legislation. And what that legislation would do would take the ban on hard rock mining on this acreage and codify it into law so that it's a forever ban. You can, as dictated by law, not conduct hard rock mining in this geography on federal lands. That's an important caveat because that'll get to kind of where we're going to. And it's that 20-year ban, that public land order, that has been the target of sort of a retribution campaign, if you want to call it that, but it's been in sort of the eye of those in power since they've been on the campaign trail in 2024. And so since Trump's second term began, you know, we knew from the jump that we were going to be playing a lot of defense and really needing to, you know, have our ducks in a row to figure out how do we protect what we've accomplished? How do we push back? Because if you remember Project 2025, the document that was sort of understood to be the blueprint for the agenda for the second term, the only mention of our state was overturning these protections. If you search the entirety of the document and look up Minnesota, it was all about reversing these protections and giving leases to Twin Metals, Minnesota, which is pretty wild, in my opinion. And there was a lot of campaign trail promises and this, that, the other thing. So we knew we had it in. Mr. Pete Stauber, your representative and neighbor, he has really championed not only trying to advance the Twin Metals mine, but to overturn these protections, which he mischaracterizes as unlawful. And so, you know, there were two roads that we were thinking that we would see action on. The executive branch, you know, seeing like the Department of Interior take action to undo the previous Interior Secretary's action. That would have made sense. That would have been within their authority to do that. Or legislative attempts to overturn the protections. And so if we kind of get into their minds, this has been one administration does one thing, the other one undoes it, and kind of back and forth at the executive branch. And so if we were them and we were thinking about durability and sort of some sense of security for the company and for the leases, we would think about legislation. We would think about codifying, overturning these protections and granting mineral leases into law. And that's exactly what we saw through various channels throughout 2025. So basically every opportunity where there was must-pass legislation like budget reconciliation or appropriations, these big packages that have to pass, Mr. Stauber was right there ready to hook some language on that legislation about overturning these protections, granting mineral leases. So in addition to his own standalone bill, his standalone bill would have overturned the 20-year protections, granted Twin Metals Minnesota 4 mineral leases, not just the 2 that they previously had claimed to, and would have given them 70-year lease terms. Usually lease terms are 10 years, and it would have barred judicial review of those leases. It also would have forced the environmental review process to be shorter than typical. And And so that was a huge threat, but we actually saw different iterations of it as riders on these different bills. So during the budget reconciliation fight last year, for example, the lease term languages was perpetual lease terms. So that's twin metals getting not 2, but 4 mineral leases with perpetual lease terms codified into law. So this is like the degree of sort of the threat, frankly. I mean, it's really, it's very, very dangerous. And we had to fight really hard to keep this out of the reconciliation process. And part of what is unique about these bills, but especially budget reconciliation, is that it's not subject to the filibuster. And so it's easier to actually pass these bills because you only need a simple majority in the Senate, as opposed to the 60 vote threshold. And so we were able to fight all of these off. And we sort of thought to ourselves, well, that's gotta be it. I mean, this seemed like plan A, B, and C for legislation. And, this was a long time coming. These are things that we thought about. But lo and behold, they had yet another trick up their sleeve. And so what just happened was basically that they used something called the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act is a bill that was passed in 1996 that is meant to give Congress some oversight and input into administrative rulemaking, which is in and of itself a very specific and defined process in DC. That like rulemaking is in and of itself a process. The definition of what is a rule is very specific. And so the Congressional Review Act, essentially, if an agency creates a rule, a lawmaker can introduce a resolution of disapproval. It can be on the Senate side or the House side or both, that basically says, I don't like this rule. They then have 60 working days, not calendar days, but working days, to pass that resolution, and the rule gets overturned. And no substantially similar rule can ever be put in place by a future administration ever again. And so the CRA, as we call it, has been used and abused because in that 60-day time frame, you only need a simple majority in both chambers to pass this legislation. So it's also not filibusterable. And so what we saw, usually these rules have to be things that just happened, right? They just were created. Someone in that office made a rule, they submitted it to the congressional record, we're done, here it is. Someone submits a resolution of disapproval, and then the process goes on. What happened was that the public land order, which has never been defined legally as a rule, and public land orders have never been determined to be rules that are subject to scrutiny under the CRA, it was introduced to the congressional record as if it was a brand new rule by the Interior Department Undersecretary. So they just lobbed it into the congressional record like it was new. The next day, Mr. Stauber introduced House Joint Resolution 140, which was the resolution to undo this rule, the 20-year mining ban, and thus started the congressional clock. And we were off to the races fighting something that we thought we would not be fighting, because this has literally never been done before. It felt so not in the realm of possibility, and yet they put it into the realm of possibility. And it sets up a really dangerous precedent for public lands across the country, because now public land orders and mineral withdrawals are on the table to be challenged and overturned through this avenue. So, between early January, when this was introduced, and April, when it was passed out of the Senate, we worked really hard. I think I was in DC for about 6 weeks of the first 4 months of the year. I have made a point of sharing this slide because this is just a slice of the pie of the people who helped and who I was in touch with and who fought by our side and made a really big difference as we ran around the halls of the House fighting misinformation from Twin Metals, or tried desperately to get in touch with Senator Sheehy, who went to Camp Widgewagon. And so we thought, dang, maybe we can get him. He knows what the Boundary Waters is about. It's a little trite to say, but like the friends we made along the way, we're a really strong movement. We always have been, and I'll get more into this, but the silver lining of this loss right now is that we're stronger than we've ever been before. And I'll say more about that, but this is just a small picture of who was involved from January when we fought it in the House to when we fought it in the Senate. And the House, what is my next slide? Nope. The House vote was interesting, and I like to show a little bit of, like, talk a little bit about behind the scenes stuff, because we know that protecting the boundary waters has broad bipartisan support. 70% of Minnesotans across all political identities support protecting the boundary waters from this type of mining. We know that Americans from all backgrounds love public lands. Last summer, Senator Mike Lee tried to sell off millions of acres of public lands, and people showed up in a way that blew folks' minds. They didn't know what the issue was going to be that was going to bring people from far right and far left onto the same page, and it was public lands, and it was the public land sell-off. And what is granting perpetual leases in the headwaters of the boundary waters to a foreign mining company than a sell-off? So we really tried to hitch our wagon to that message, and that did carry us through, and we were able to really make some very significant partnerships and headway, and both votes were actually bipartisan. So in the House, we lost Congressman Jared Golden. He's a Democrat from Maine's 2nd Congressional District. He's not running again. He's friends with Stauber. So he's out. But Representative Don Bacon from Omaha, Nebraska is a Republican who voted in favor of protecting the boundary waters. So if you know anyone in Omaha, or you yourself want to pick up the phone and thank Don Bacon, he needs to get a lot of love. And we've been pushing out, a lot of folks to just give him a call, because he told us that he had never been lobbied harder on something in his whole legislative career than on the boundary waters. On the Senate side, we only needed 4 Republican senators to win the vote. There were 2 points at which we did have those 4 votes, but the White House got involved and was making calls and cutting deals and scaring people, honestly. And so we ended up getting 2 Republican senators, Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, and Senator Susan Collins from Maine. I had the great pleasure of watching the vote from the gallery and the Senate side. Stauber was behind me. That was fun. He was also on my plane ride home, which was a little difficult to stomach. And it was really interesting because we knew that there were at least a dozen Republicans who had very significant doubts about this vote. They were worried about what precedent it would set. They thought it was a crappy vote for one reason or another, either because they are really invested in international critical mineral policy and are irked by this sort of domestic mining at all costs narrative that's going on, or like Mr. Sheehy, who knows the place, who's from St. Paul. And I was able to just witness sort of the reality of Washington, D.C., where people who we knew loved the boundary waters went up and voted in favor of the resolution. One senator went up to the table, saw it was boundary waters, something boundary waters related, and said, "Oh, I love the boundary waters. I vote in favor," and then he walked out. It wasn't a question. It's not really about the thing. It's about who you serve. And here's a lot of people who purport to serve the American people who are not actually working in their interests. And so that was really hard to watch. Mr. Sheehy he was actually presiding over the Senate that day. He read a paperback book while Senator Smith spoke. He wouldn't look at her, and he literally was reading a book. And I think that's a shame. I think that's really shameful behavior. And I hope Camp Widgewagon does some accountability for him. And so, yes, the vote passed. the resolution passed, the 20-year protections that we worked for are gone. That acreage that I showed you is back in the federal mining portfolio. And so what we anticipate is the issuance of federal mineral leases. We still are not sure if they're gonna come from the executive branch or if they're gonna come from the legislative branch. But actually just today, I spent my morning reading the House Interior Appropriations Bill because there's inclusion of the issuance of 2 mineral leases in there. So again, that's a rider on a must-pass bill that basically says, as part of this package, these 2 mineral leases have to be issued within 90 days of the signature of this bill. You'll be happy to know that a lot of riders on that particular piece of legislation tend to fall off. People are it's a well-known sort of ploy to just toss a bunch of spaghetti at the wall on a bill, and a lot of it, kind of falls off the wall before it crosses the finish line, but we're starting to see it. The vultures are landing, so to speak. So we expect the issuance of federal mineral leases. We expect an environmental analysis of some kind. The National Environmental Policy Act that really governs the process for these sorts of decisions and decision-making has really been gutted very significantly. So what we're preparing for, usually if they're, granting mineral leases, it's an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement to understand what would the impact of these mineral leases here be. And usually those comment periods are 30, 60, 90, 120 days. We expect a 7-day comment period. Because that's the degree to which they are truncating and shortening these processes. So Chaco Canyon had a 7-day comment period for expanding a border on oil and gas development in the area. And so we're working off of some models that we've already seen in action. So we're gonna have to organize very quickly. We're gonna have to really be loud, be proud, because even though we're disappointed and we did have a loss, there is still a lot of work to do, and the fight is very, very far from over. So federal mineral leases, a mine plan, again, environmental review. Like I mentioned, the NEPA has been gutted. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act is, there's rulemaking that's going on that, where we expect the new rule to come out actually this spring. That will likely severely limit tribal and state authority in project review. So that's a really big red flag that we're looking out for, as well as a permitting bill on the federal level that got Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is essentially the EPA kill switch for a project. So that these things extend, beyond this particular project, but they're things that we're also working with national partners to monitor and fight back on where we're able to. What is our saving grace right now? Because right now we're in doom and gloom zone. We have an opportunity to permanently protect the boundary waters, and we could do it as soon as a year from now. So the role of the state plays a super, super critical backstop role. In a few different ways. So no matter where your project is, non-ferrous, so hard rock mine project is, if it's on state land, private land, federal land, you need a state permit to mine to do anything. And that is issued by the state, that is signed by the DNR commissioner. And there's a lot that goes into that and gets to that point. But if a company doesn't have that document, they can't mine. And that's an important backstop. The state legislature can act. So that's what I say when I'm saying something could happen a year from now. Depending on how the midterms go, we could see protective legislation passed successfully in the 2027-2028 legislative biennium in the state. And what the legislation is, it's permanent protection legislation. So it's just like Senator Smith and Representative McCollum's legislation, but it's on the state level. And what this bill does is prohibit hard rock mining on all state lands in the watershed of the boundary waters, but it also bars the issuance of the state permit to mine for non-ferrous projects in that geography. Meaning you are by law not allowed to permit a hard rock mine in this area. So this is the thing right now that we all need to be fighting for, because this is the thing that's gonna make the difference in the near term. Sorry, my watch told me I just got my step goals from all my gesticulating. So permanent protection legislation, it's critical, it's the thing, it's our North Star now. It is the best chance that we have at securing permanent protections for the watershed of the Boundary Waters. It's about the state fighting back against the feds. And it's something that we can do. We just have to put our heads down and do the damn thing. Pardon my French. So like I said, the bill numbers are gonna change, so you don't have to, and I'd like to share some information that maybe could be sent out with folks who are here tonight, just so we have some really easy action links on our website. Ways in which you can engage with your state representative and your state senator, because they really, really need to hear from you. Who's represented by state? Is it all Grant Hoschild? No, Pete Johnson and Leash and Jens? Oh, in the Senate, okay. So yeah, I mean, it's a very important group of people, especially State Senator Hoschild. He definitely needs to hear from anyone who will reach out to him. So this is really kind of where we need to be putting our time and attention. There are other things that are being asked of the state government. So we are in conversation with the governor's office. We have a good relationship with the governor's office, and we are really fighting for a few key things that his administration could do, yet in his sort of lame duck term, that actually, for the most part, he's done before. So a lot of people don't know about the actions that his administration have taken before because they've been sort of through the DNR or sort of quieter behind the scenes. But he was in office when, you know, the Trump administration overturned the process and actually started to advance the project and did some of these things. So we're asking essentially for a moratorium on the Department of Natural Resources reviewing anything pertaining to this mine. You know, the governor could direct his agencies to say, we're not doing this. We're not going to review this. Don't do it. Because delay is important. The more we can delay and also throw sort of sand in the gears, the better. The second thing that the administration can do, there is a state mineral lease. So the Twin Metals project is made up of state and federal mineral leases. There's one state mineral lease that is not near the project. It's pretty far south, so it wouldn't actually have a material impact on whether or not the mine could move forward. But it is a very important step for the governor to take to signal that they want to protect the Boundary Waters by taking this opportunity, this unique opportunity they have only this year to take away the state mineral lease. And then also just push back on what's happening again at the federal level. So reject joint environmental review with the federal government, fight against attempts to circumvent public comment or environmental review or tribal consultation, which are all really significant things that, you know, if they put mineral leases into place through legislation, they avoid all those things. They don't need to do an iota of it. So pushing back on those attempts to circumvent those processes, and then opposing any land exchanges between the company and the federal government. So the state plays an extremely important role, and there are many things that we can do to continue to fight back. I think something that is also worth remembering is that this project really doesn't have the social license. I really think that there's a lot of people who are more angry than they've ever been before and don't feel listened to and feel like they've been spoken on behalf of. And so I mentioned this before, but the silver lining of sort of this concept of laws is sometimes you need a fire under your butt to get you moving. And I mean, we saw Senator Klobuchar make the remarks that she made on the floor of the Senate. Senator Klobuchar has never said anything about this project that's been substantive. And she made 15-minute remarks twice, and is in favor of protecting the wilderness. So I think that's an example, but also just how many people from across the country, across the state, so many organizations are really, really galvanized by what's happening to the Boundary Waters watershed, what it means for other beloved places, and how we can all work together to protect the many places that we love. So I kind of already mentioned what you could do to help. I will follow up with anyone who wants sort of action links that make it really easy to call your state representatives and senators. We've got material in the back, we've got stickers, annual reports, this, that, the other thing. And I probably talked longer than I was supposed to, but I will make time for questions now. So thank you.
So any sense where Governor Klobuchar would go on this issue?
I think that we've done polling many, many years in a row, and it very consistently shows somewhere around 2/3 of Minnesotans wanting permit protection for the Boundary Waters watershed. And I think she's really finally absorbed that is in her candidacy as governor. I think she realizes that people perceived her as kind of on the fence, and when people were starting to get mad and ask, where's Amy, where's Amy, where's Amy? She finally had to make a decision and be public about that decision. It was kind of funny because she has a coffee every Thursday, a Minnesota morning in DC, where she serves pizza from the Iron Range and comes and talks about stuff she's got going on. And it was the week of the vote. And so she was saying, we've got the Boundary Waters vote, and everyone keeps asking me, where's Amy? Where's Amy? Where's Amy? And it's like, when Tina has things or I have things and Tina doesn't participate, no one's like, where's Tina? Where's Tina? So she was kind of like being gripey but clearly it gets to her, right? Like she does sort of feel that pressure. And so I was really pleased that she came out with that statement. I don't think she's going to be able to sort of take that sort of thing back. And she's starting to talk more at fundraisers about how proud she is of the work that went into protecting the Boundary Waters during the Congressional Review Act campaign. And indeed, we did work with her office a fair amount. So I'm hopeful that she'll be good as governor, but we are also, trying to think about ways to set her up for success. Because I'm also sure that she would love to not have to deal with this at all. In a perfect world.
I think we're seeing her daddy, Jim. I've been waiting for Jim to show up.
Yeah, she did not like the article about her dad. Yeah, I think but yeah, I mean, her dad was a significant figure, and I really appreciated her actually just telling her story. I just not really felt like we've seen or heard the sort of full context of her positionality on mining and why it is the way it is. And I know that's politics, but I have not heard it myself, so.
So is the use of the Congressional Review Act challengeable?
That is being sorted out by legal minds far sharper and more depth than mine, but that is a question, because technically part of the Congressional Review Act is that there can be no judicial review of the outcome of the use of the Congressional Review Act. That being said, it is so unprecedented. The way the public land order was submitted for consideration by the Interior Department 3 years after the fact, there are elements that people are considering, especially because of the precedent it sets for other public lands fights. So litigation is being sort of developed and figured out, but it's definitely on many people's minds in the coalition of how exactly we're going to approach suing around the CRA piece. In addition to litigating, of course, the mineral leases, which we've done many times before.
And then if I could ask one more, you had it on the screen about US Forest Service having to
Consent,
consent,
yes.
and where that whole process is at.
Yeah, so.
I know politically what's gonna happen. But
Right, so, what we're referring to is. Oh, that's nice. Sorry, yay, Carlton. Maybe it's Susan of Susan's iPad is the Carlton alum. Yeah, so we have a unique system because the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, since there's a split management of the federal lands and minerals, Forest Service doing the surface, the Bureau of Land Management doing the minerals. That we have a unique agreement that when it comes to leasing and leasing decisions, the Bureau of Land Management is in charge, but it is required by law that they get the consent of the US Forest Service. And so that is kind of been this thing that's sort of hanging out there because the chief of the Forest Service is actually somebody who's been around for a minute, and we used to meet with him during the Biden years, and they did not give their consent previously when this happened, and they've put out their position. And every now and again, we sort of think, okay, it's now is another good time to have the Forest Service reiterate that their position hasn't changed from the last time they denied consent, because that strengthens the legal argument, arbitrary and capricious, when eventually, because of politics, they say, I've changed my mind. And so as recently as like the week or two before the inauguration, the Forest Service reaffirmed their position in a letter. And so when the consent issue comes up, I think it will be predictable what happens. But I do think that that will give us a stronger leg to stand on in terms of litigation. But again, if they do the lease issuance purely through legislation, then they don't need the consent. It really circumvents a lot of these processes that are extremely important and are important really for litigation. I think they understand that that is the most at-risk strategy for them to pursue on these leases in terms of, you know, how fast we'll sue the pants off of them and how strong our argument will be.
Question online, how do the 1854 tribes exercise their treaty rights in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question, Judy. So the 1854 tribes, Bois Fort, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage exercised the right to hunt, fish, and gather in this area at minimum. And you know, I had a logo of the National Congress of American Indians on the slide about groups that we worked with. The tribal voices in the Congressional Review Act fight were absolutely critical. And you know, there's been a sort of dark history of some of these bands coming out against this project and really feeling economic retribution for it. Tom Bach organized a boycott of the casino, took away the DFL, you know, convention in like 2016 there. And so I'm really grateful and pleased because not only did the three treaty bands get involved, but sort of the Midwest Council, sort of the National Council, tribes were calling their state senators across the country. And it had a really important, it made people really pause on the vote. So that makes that, I'm wandering from your question, Judy, but the 1854 treaty rights pertain a lot to the right and ability to hunt, fish, and gather in this region, which is why it's so important to protect monoman, wild rice, fish species, bird species, et cetera, because you can't exercise your treaty rights if everything is poison or dead.
Well, I don't want to not get too emotional here. But I thought tonight, as I listened and watched you, I was reminded of some of the trips where Saturday morning, maybe I'd drive up to 106 East Wilson Street with one of the kids in a canoe. And Elizabeth would make a big cinnamon roll for us. And C and I would talk. And once we got through some of the issues in the 70s, we were on one of those, we were together and I don't know, we went up to the listening point of work. And he said to me, the next big thing is gonna be hard rock mine, copper. I'm not going anywhere really except to try to tell you that if Sig and Elizabeth were alive and saw you, they would smile. They love you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot. I feel so supported by a legacy. The thing that keeps me in the work and keeps me able to do it is thinking about people like Sagan Elizabeth, thinking about all the people who came before me and all the people who will come after me who hopefully have no idea who I am, because that's the point. You know, they should just be able to enjoy the Boundary Waters the way it is and get that opportunity. And there's just an incredible community of advocates that make me feel really assured in what we're going to achieve, which is permanent protection for the Boundary Waters.
Does Canada have any reaction to this and the impact on your waters?
Yes, so there's a 1909 treaty that basically we won't pollute yours if you don't pollute ours. One of the first communities that would be impacted by pollution is the Lochnatroy First Nation. And I apologize, I know that they recently changed their name and I have only heard it spoken once or twice, so I am not gonna try to pronounce it. I can't remember what it is. And so the Canadian government is tuned in. They submitted comments when again, the first Trump administration undid Obama era study and started to advance the project. The Canadian government actually attempted to do government to government contact, submitted a comment articulating their concerns. They were ignored. They were not responded to by our government. And now we're seeing a renewed engagement by the Canadian government. There are some members of parliament whose ears are particularly perked up. There are Treaty 3 bands and the Lochnatroy First Nation who it seems like there's kind of a storm brewing in Canada and they're getting more organized and interested in what they can do to help prevent this mine. So I think there will be more to say about the Canadians not too long, but so they are engaged in trying to figure out what their role is. So if you know any Canadians, tell them to, I don't know how advocacy works in Canada. That's something that I need to take a moment to figure out, call your member of parliament or I'm not sure how their advocacy system works, but we might end up needing to expand into Canada, doing some good organizing in Grand Portage and Port Francis and up on the border.
I was gonna say, you obviously maintained your enthusiasm for this fight in spite of some pretty difficult circumstances recently, and many of us have written letters, testified at hearings, sent in endless emails, and we hear that there's this huge majority of people doing the same, and yet it doesn't solve the problem. What's your thought about, I guess we just have to keep doing it because we hope it works, but what's your thought around that effort? I mean, they always tell us, stay engaged, keep working,
Yeah.
keep sending in emails and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it is exhausting. I mean, I think that is something that people get burnt out from this work and the constant sort of urgency, the economy of urgency is exhausting. But I think we do have the power of the people, but I think this is if you really boil it down, it's industry. It's the influence of industry on politics, both at the micro level, as small as the mayor of Ely, Minnesota, the city council of Ely, Minnesota, to the federal government all taking the lead of one person who has an agenda and as proven in some of these primaries over the past few days, has a lot of power to kind of make or break you. And despite you being a representative of the people, we're advancing a project that benefits a foreign mining conglomerate. So, and like, that's a big topic, right? But it is figuring out how to make those changes on different levels. And sometimes it feels too big and sometimes it feels really, really positive and like we're making really awesome progress. Like I was telling Bob, we have a economic and community development program in Ely. And the whole point of the program is to think about how do we strengthen the social tissue of Ely, Minnesota, so that neighbors who don't talk to each other because they disagree on mining come together over the fact that they love Ely and they want Ely to survive and they want Ely to thrive and they want the empty businesses on Sheridan Street to be filled. You know, how do we sort of unite over a shared vision? And we used to have sometimes we'd put on events or something and or like we'd walk in the July 4th parade and people would spray us with hoses. We tried to have this particular program had a block party 1 street over from Sheridan and Ely to support those businesses who don't get as much foot traffic as those on Sheridan. And there was a conversation in sort of a notorious pro mining bar where someone was like, I have a great idea. I'm gonna park a logging truck in the middle of their block party. And someone who we also know to be very vehemently pro mining said, don't you dare do that. They are trying to do something good for this community. You know, and so that, like, those interactions are really hard to measure. But that's the type of work that also makes me feel like the people power and connective people power does have something. And work some magic, and so showing up is tiring, but showing up is so important, and the community of showing up and the community of advocates at multiple levels, that will sustain. And I think that the CRA vote was also a good example because I think people thought it was going to be really, really easy to just pass this bill and not have it be a big deal. And we made Senator Thune sweat. We made him work really hard to whip the votes. And so the headline is simple, but that is a huge accomplishment in a condition where we have Mr. Stauber, who's slated to be the next Natural Resource Committee chair. So all these public lands groups are terrified of pissing him off lest they lose their fight. We have the president who's gung-ho on critical mineral development domestically. We have everybody who wants to do what he wants to do. And yet this vote was difficult, because we were clogging phone lines in Indiana and Wisconsin and California, and people who didn't think that this was their fight, it became their fight. And that was all people power. So like it does do, I swear to God, it does something. And, you know, and there's gonna be a moment where it's all gonna matter, and that's kind of the only thing, is that we're gonna shoot that shot and it'll be successful because of the result of all of this. And so I advocate for people to not give up, to take breaks, drink water,
Go canoeing.
go on a vacation, touch grass, do what you need to do to stay in it. Because apathy will be our downfall.
Is helium mining considered non-ferrous mining?
It is not. It has its own category. So this mineral withdrawal did not affect the Pulsar Helium project. Although that was a bit of misinformation that was going around in DC to sort of scare offices into thinking that it was a government overreach that affected multiple industries.
Rich Exler has a question. Wonder if there are backup discussions about adding stipulations that Minnesota copper stays in the US or North America, yada, yada, just to muck up the economic and unlawful policy acts in play.
Yeah, that actually there have been discussions about, okay, if you care so much, this is a bill that only American-owned companies can mine domestically, that copper has to stay in the US, that copper can't, sort of working off of industry talking points directly. So those have been in discussion. I know Senator Martin Heinrich, who is the chair of the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. He is the senator from New Mexico. He is amazing. We all owe him a very big thank you because he was a huge Boundary Waters champion during the CRA and still now. He's really, really active. But they're trying to think creatively because this is also something that expands again beyond the Twin Metals conversation, because there's this huge push for critical mineral development under the sort of justification of, and Stauber even said it himself, we need to mine in the Twin Metals project so that we can win the war in Iran. It's that kind of our domestic security, both in terms of going to war, taking over Cuba, whatever's next, relies on this domestic industry, because right now we rely on the Chinese Communist Party and the Russians, and, you know, it's these sort of intense scare things, and so those bills would, people are trying to think creatively about how do we kind of get that talking point, if they are so, if they're so committed to not benefiting the Chinese Communist Party, then they should outlaw projects that send their metal concentrates to Chinese smelters, all of which are owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. You know, it's, and I don't usually talk this way, you know, I'm not like anti-China or anything, like, but this is the rhetoric and language and the context that in which they discuss these things. So I do think that those bills could be powerful, and I think people are thinking about them in the broader public lands, domestic mining, critical mineral space right now.
Do you know how much of the world supply of copper and nickel is in the Duluth complex as opposed to elsewhere in the world? I mean, like, you hear people talk about it like, this is the last best place to get this, so we must mine it, but I have no idea where else it comes from.
Yeah, so it comes from a lot of places. I mean, we've sourced a lot of our copper from Chile and Canada and Norway and Australia and New Zealand, and from a lot of different allies across the country. From a domestic standpoint, the Duluth complex does represent a large deposit of copper nickel. But the convenient and confusing sort of talking point that they lean into is they say the Duluth complex is the largest untapped mineral resource of this type in America. But we're not talking about mining the entirety of the Duluth complex. We're talking about mining 1/16. There are 16 deposits that make up the Duluth complex, and the Twin Metals project at this point would be one. And so if we were to actually mine the entire Duluth complex, we would be mining the entire Arrowhead region. The Arrowhead would become the copper range. And so really, that is only talking about it in its entirety, but when you take it down to a single deposit, the actual wealth of the ore is less than 1%. It's less than 1% mineralization. So it's over 99% of what comes out of the ground is the most toxic part of this type of mining, which is, you know, the tailings, the ore, the waste rock. And so I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it is important to clarify that, like, we're not standing in between mining the most wealthy untapped single deposit on Birch Lake. You know, that presumes that this project's just the beginning and we're gonna mine the entire Arrowhead, which is not gonna happen.
Isn't the fact that the percentage of ore is so low in the rock part of the reason that these mining companies kind of do a low quality approach, because they can't make money unless they kind of do it on the cheap? Is that true? I mean, that's kind of my impression.
That's part of it. I mean, I also think that, yeah, it needs to be economically viable. This project has not ever been determined to be sort of an economically viable project, but that's why this moment is also so dangerous for the advancement, because the administration has been investing in critical minerals projects. They've been bankrolling these companies and these projects. And so, you know, the more sort of shortcuts and benefits we give to these companies, the more economically viable these sort of one-off projects become. But yeah, it is my understanding that, or they do what they need to do to start up a mine, and then they go bankrupt much sooner than anticipated and leave everyone with the cleanup costs. I mean, maybe they cut some corners, but the other thing about permitting a project like this is, you know, people forget that you don't submit permit applications with information in them that makes you think you're not going to get your permit. You know, you're applying for something, you're sort of putting your best face forward, which is why this type of mining has never been done without some form of pollution, especially when you compare it to what's predicted in the permits. You know, so it is sort of, they put on a face, they make the money, and then they ditch, knowing even though if maybe it's not all that economically viable, they'll get what they need to get out of it if they're going to get the permits, and they can leave whenever they want to.
We don't have any post-closure care provisions with our permits, do we? We're going to set a certain amount of money aside, assuming they do go bankrupt.
There is a financial assurance piece of legislation at the state level that is trying to bolster that concept, that very concept, that protective concept. You can find more information about that bill. Maybe does Duluth for Clean Water have it on their website? I know Friends of Boundary Waters has it on their website. It's the financial assurance legislation in the state. I don't have the bill number off the top of my head, but so people are trying to think about how to do that, right? Like just maybe mining companies wouldn't even move forward if they knew that for the 500 years of legacy pollution, they would have to put down X number of dollars ahead of time. That makes it really financial. Like if the government is or others are really trying to make it financially viable, we got to do things that neutralize that, right? By talking about like financial accountability in a more meaningful way. Yeah.
I don't know if it'd be useful, but Arizona has similar mining going on. And having been down there quite a bit to visit friends and relatives, I saw over time how they affected a huge amount of area. And I don't know though if slides of that sort of thing in your presentation would shake people up and say, oh, wow, we can't have that in Minnesota.
Yeah, we have used images of like the disaster in Mount Polly because, which is in British Columbia, just because of it's more similar in terms of the ecosystem than Arizona, but you're right. I mean, people are impacted by just even aerial shots of the scope of this type of mining. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Areas affected are measured more like in square miles.
Right.
Huge area.
Huge areas, yeah.
Utah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ingrid. This was wonderful. Could you say something about whether new mines are even necessary to secure these minerals?
Yeah, that is a good point to make. No, I mean, the list, sometimes the bullet point list of why this is a bad idea and why it's not necessary gets long. And so sometimes I forget some, but that's a great point. So copper is one of the most recyclable metal in the world. We have an abundant supply, hundreds of years already at our disposal, as well as meaningful trade relationships with allies. And so, I think two facts that are often thrown out that are not true are that we need new mining because we're going to run out of these minerals. We do not have a short supply of the primary metals that are coming out of these mines. Copper wasn't even considered a critical mineral until the USGS put it on the list in this Trump administration because it gets special treatment as a critical mineral. We need to do it here. We need to bolster our supply, this, that, the other thing. We have plenty. We have a lot of other options for getting copper. So that is another thing is like, we don't need to be starting any mines. There's this sort of work to identify what exists and a really, really strong push to develop all of it because the framework of this Interior Department in particular is that American public lands are a balance sheet, and that includes the minerals underneath them. And so they're weighing them more like sort of piggy banks, not in the sense of for American enjoyment and recreation, but for what's underneath them. So the short answer, yes, no, we don't need new mines to have the copper that we need in this country.
So people might point to the two biggest threats we have is Russia and China. And on the surface, that might look like it's something, but the Ukrainians have Russia on its knees. They've never been weaker. They're not a threat. And China is a myth when you say it's big, it's powerful. Their military is very, very, very weak in reality. And of course, people won't point that out if they want to use China as a arguing point. But China is no threat.
Yeah, in the context I've heard folks talk about China is the AI race and sort of the electrification and just the degree of this sort of, mostly the AI battery and technology race and how they have the smelting capacity. And so from an industry standpoint, they have much better infrastructure to receive mineral concentrates and to export them. And they've really been committing a tremendous amount of minerals and energy and funds into developing a lot of infrastructure around AI in particular. And so I've seen it sort of be that threat, that this is sort of the new arms race or the new space race is their AI and battery building capabilities and their export markets.
We got one more question up there on the board that we should.
Yeah, read that one, it's so long.
It is a 5 to 7 year pilot scale demonstration project of the thus far untested new technology train for pollutant removal and option for compromise. A large partnership with design by a blue chip panel. I don't think this requirement would be considered rocket science in other realms of natural resource management, or is it now all or nothing from the admin? Woof.
That's why, this is Rich Axler. So. And
Rich, maybe you could email me.
on this one.
My eyes went a little cross-eyed reading that question, but I would be happy to talk to you about it, but yeah, I have to digest that. Yeah,
I think he's asking if there's a middle ground where we can try a pilot project to see if this really works.
oh,
Friend of our eyes, so-
At this point, just going in for the kill.
Yeah, he is within WRX.
got it, understood. I mean, that is part of the challenge, right? And sometimes I find myself, I don't know, if folks heard me on NPR, I was there with Julie Lucas a few weeks ago, who is the executive director of Mining Minnesota, who's really been sort of the
Okay.
spokesperson. She wrote the DNT article today.
Yes.
Yeah, and that is a sort of frequent talking point, is like, let us prove that we have the technology. And the problem with that is that,
Not in this place, not in this.
well,
location.
yeah, to conduct an experiment is to take a risk. And what we are saying is that we don't have a risk tolerance for an experiment 1.5 miles upstream of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness and surrounding 4.3 million acre freshwater boreal ecosystem. Because we're not down for that failure. And so I do think like a lot of it, you can boil it down a little bit to risk tolerance. And so I don't know about pilot programs, because this is a very unique ecosystem. And so when we talk about what it looks like here in particular, I don't know who is gonna wanna run that pilot program anywhere, like nobody wants to be the guinea pig.
Existing copper mine is a pilot project.
Right, exactly. How many pilot projects do we need? They're already all doing it, so, yeah.
In this environment. Well, one more question. That's, you're very good, last shot.
Okay, they quit making pennies. Do we really need this copper?
Yeah, that's the new campaign. Collect your pennies, send them to Twin Meadows.
Thanks, Ingrid, for really informative. Using the back, we don't wanna bring any home, so grab one on your way out.
And my card is also on the table back there, and it has my number on it, and y'all can just reach me anytime. I'm really happy to chat and connect and whatnot.
This is recorded, so we'll get it on our YouTube
If you're.
at some point.
I can look and put it in.
I will do that.